All right, let's try this again. Hello, everybody. If anybody is still with me, my name is Trent Brown once again, and I'm here to try to talk about my book, Murder in McComb, the Tina Andrews case. Let me apologize for the difficulty that I had just a moment ago with my internet connection here at home. Working from home, as a lot of us have figured recently, is always a challenge. So I'm not sure who heard what that I tried to say a few minutes ago, so let me start again. Here's the book, Murder in McComb, the Tina Andrews case. Published in February of 2020 by LSU Press. Let me thank again LB Kovac and everyone else at LSU for helping to organize this event this afternoon. Needless to say, the technical difficulties were on my end and not theirs. I want to thank LSU again for publishing the book. They're outstanding to work with. I highly recommend them to authors and to readers. University presses need our support these days, and we need the values of the humanities, the social sciences, and the fine arts that university presses like LSU bring to us. All right, so hello again. If you're watching and have questions or comments about the book, please type them. I should be able to read them, and I will try to answer them as we move along. Let me say something about the origin of this book, the subject of the book, and what I tried to do in it. About 4 years ago, in late 2016, I logged into Facebook and received a message from someone I had not received a message from before. And the person said to me, "What do you know about the Tina Andrews case?" And my answer was nothing at all. And 3 years later, I had finished this book on the subject, and now I feel that I know a little more than I did when I began. So let me tell you something about the book itself. The setting is McComb, which is a small town of about 10,000 people in the southwestern part of the state of Mississippi. It was founded in 1872. Like a number of Mississippi towns, it was a railroad town. And for many years, the shops and maintenance shops and other facilities for the southern line of the Illinois Central Railroad were located in McComb. It provided very good employment for several generations of McComb men. There was also other light industry in McComb. The city had a blue-collar tenor, you could say, that a lot of other small Mississippi towns did not. The more recent history that's significant for this case particularly is that McComb in the 1960s became one of the central battlegrounds, literally, of the civil rights movement in the state. In 1961 and again in 1964, local African Americans in McComb and Pike County mounted a very sharp challenge to this segregated order there, and some white residents of the county and of the city of McComb responded violently. And even by contemporary standards, the violence in McComb was shocking. It was also bad for business, a lot of prominent people in the community realized. And so through 1964, there was a wave of bombings and other terrorist activities in the community. By the end of 1964, those bombings had largely ceased, but the resonances of that violence continued for several years. People of power and influence in town recognized that the violence had been very bad for the community, for its reputation. And McComb people, like other Americans in the late 1960s, were very concerned with issues of law and order. They perceived that courts, the police, churches, and other traditional arbiters of authority did not enjoy the same kind of respect that they had in earlier years. By the late 1960s, by the early 1970s, a number of people in McComb had come to terms, to some extent, with the changes in civil rights laws of the period. They understood that things could not go back literally to the way that they had been before. They were trying to navigate into a new decade, into a new understanding of what was and was not possible. And they said to themselves and to other people in the community, trust the institutions, trust the police, trust the courts. These are the institutions that are going to maintain law and order in the community. Now that's the context in which this story unfolded. Tina Andrews, the girl who is pictured on the front of this book, was born in 1957. She died in 1969. As a child growing up in the community, she certainly didn't have the kind of perspective to understand what was unfolding around her. Probably like most children, she was more concerned with her family, with her friends, with school, with day-to-day activities. And looking at things in a broader perspective is not a habit that a child has cultivated. But older people in the community would have understood very well the significance, or at least would have had more memories of the period through which they had just passed. Now, it's a murder story. It's a true crime story. And so let me get to that part that will interest some of you maybe particularly. In 1969, in August of 1969, on the 13th, Tina Andrews and a friend of hers named Billy Joe Lambert left a teenaged club in downtown McComb, walked to the corner of the street, and accepted what they thought would be a ride home from a couple of older men who offered that ride. The ride ended up not being a ride home. 10 days later, Tina Andrews' body was discovered a couple of miles west of McComb in a clearing in pine woods and pasture. It was a place where oil was being pumped from the ground. It was not an oil field in the sense of a West Texas scene or an Oklahoma scene. It was fairly near town, but it was also fairly concealed. The area was used as a parking spot by teenaged and adult couples who were looking for privacy. So on August 23rd, on a Saturday morning, oil field workers were checking equipment at the site, and they found the badly decomposed body of a girl. She was not immediately identified as Tina Andrews. Now, the body was significantly deteriorated. This was August in Mississippi, and the heat and conditions were also exacerbated by Hurricane Camille, the after effects of which had recently. So it wasn't until the next month that the body was identified as a 12-year-old local girl. Now, Tina Andrews came from a working class family. By no measure would anyone in town have thought of her as socially prominent. Her family was not wealthy. They did not have power or influence in town. From the beginning, local authorities investigated the killing. It was clear that it was a homicide. The sheriff's department, the police department, FBI agents from an area field office, highway patrol investigators, all looked into the matter. But despite their identifying scores of suspects and following leads for well over a year, nothing happened to break the case. This was in 1969, in August. It wasn't until 1971, the beginning of the year, that the case broke. Now, Joe Pygott was the district attorney in McComb, or in Pike County at the time. And in early 1971, Pygott received a phone call from a woman who told him that she knew someone who was a witness to the killing, or at least could provide information that was relevant to the case. And in early 1971, District Attorney Joe Pygott interviewed a girl who said that she had been in the oil field that evening with Tina Andrews. And the story that she told him seemed credible. It also led the following month to Pygott's successfully seeking indictments against 2 current McComb police officers. And so the murder happens in 1969. Not until 1971 are there arrests and indictments. And in 1971 and in 1972, one of the men arrested and indicted was tried twice for the murder of Tina Andrews. And so the book attempts to tell the story of the investigation. It attempts to tell the story of the background of the community, and the book also attempts to explain why the trials of the men, why the arrests of the men and the trials of one of the 2 men resulted in no one ever being convicted for the killing of Tina Andrews. Now, as a matter of criminal investigation, as a matter of a story of law and the courts, the problem for a prosecutor in the case was that no one could say that she had witnessed the killing of Tina Andrews. There were no smoking guns, literally or figuratively. Forensic science in the era was not remotely what we're familiar with today. If you're a fan of true crime television shows, this was well before DNA evidence. And so the case that the district attorney was able to build was built largely on the testimony of one witness, a witness who could not testify that she saw someone actually kill the 12-year-old Tina Andrews. Now, let me stop for a moment. Let me read a passage, and then I will follow up with an explanation of some of the significances of the passage and of the larger story. I'm picking up the story when the girls accepted a ride from the 2 older men. They didn't take them home. They took them instead out west of town to the oil field. The evening was quiet and isolated, probably seeming even more so under the darkness of a new moon. Many people in town, even girls their age, knew the location to be a good place for couples looking for privacy. But the girls had had enough. When the car stopped, they were getting out and going home, one way or another. That is when the ride to the oil field turned deadly. The moment the men stopped, Billy Joe stepped out of one side of the car. Tina got out of the other. Billy Joe had a clear shot toward the road that would take her back toward McComb and eventually home. Tina did not. She had to cross around the front of the car to get away from the men. When she did that, one of the men, the one who had been driving, grabbed Tina by the arm. Billy Joe heard Tina tell the son of a bitch to let her go. Infuriated, the man said that no one called him that name and got away with it. Billy Joe was moving quickly now, and it was dark, but she did look back in time to see the man who had grabbed Tina hit her in the face, and he struck her hard. So Billy Joe began to run. She continued to run and then to walk as she made her way back to her home on Cherry Street, a distance of well over 3 miles. She was 13 years old and scared. She did not stop at any house or business to ask for help, nor did she seek any rides, given how this one had turned out. When she arrived home, it was late, but Billy Joe did not check a clock to see what time it was. Because she had not been wearing shoes, her feet were swollen and bruised, and they hurt. People at her house were still up watching television. They were irritated at Billy Joe for being out late again, but no one, including her mother, wanted to hear excuses or any story about where she had been or what she had done. So Billy Joe said nothing to them then or for some time to come about what had happened that night. Billy Joe Lambert never saw her friend Tina Andrews again. The driver of the car, the man who hit Tina in the face, had in fact hit her hard, so hard that he broke her jaw. Sometime after that, one of the men took a .38 caliber revolver, which he happened to be carrying, and shot Tina in the back of the head. Why he shot Tina, or what else they did to her before or after they killed her, Billy Joe could not have known. No one other than the 2 people left there in the oil field ever knew that. When the men were done with Tina, they left her body, concealed under an old couch they had rolled on top of her. Then they drove away, going back to whatever else they had to do on a Wednesday night in McComb, Mississippi. Okay. Now, one of the problems then for the prosecution in seeking a conviction in the case was not only the time that it had taken, well over a year from the discovery of the body to the indictments, but also the witness who came forward proved to be vulnerable. The witness had not come forward for so long because she said she was frightened because she believed that if police officers had killed her friend, what might happen to her should she come forward. She was 15 years old in 1971 when she prepared to testify in the trial that fall. She was 15 and she was also the mother of a 6-week-old child. Now, the defense attorney who represented the police officer who was on trial was a very capable and very aggressive attorney. He's precisely the kind of person that you would want to have if you were standing trial for murder. He understood the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of the witness, Billy Joe Lambert. He framed the story that he told the jury essentially as this: who do you believe? Who do you support? Law and order as represented with this young police officer on trial, or do you support this disreputable girl, this unwed mother, this 15-year-old from an undistinguished family who is presenting evidence in a trial about the murder of another girl from an undistinguished family? And so the jury was asked to weigh this evidence in the context of a broader argument about respectability, about proper behavior of children, especially girl children, and I argue the larger forces that had shaped McComb in the years leading up to the trial. Now, there were 2 trials. The first ended in 1971 in a hung jury. It came very close to a conviction. 2 jurors held out for acquittal, so the great majority of the jurors were in favor of conviction. But because this was Mississippi and not Louisiana, This is a nod to my Louisiana folks watching. Because it was Mississippi and not Louisiana, the jury did need to be unanimous to win a conviction. There was a retrial in the spring of 1972. And retrials are almost always a bit easier for the defense than prosecution. The defense has heard what the prosecution has to offer. No new evidence had come forward in the months between the trials, and the defendant was acquitted in 1972. The jury again was asked to weigh whether they believed that the word of a 15-year-old was sufficient to outweigh that of a police officer who had a well-established and well-rehearsed alibi for the evening in question. And so no one has ever been convicted of the slaying of this 12-year-old girl. The second of the two men indicted was never tried. After the acquittal of the first of the two police officers, the district attorney decided that the case against the second was not strong enough to go to trial. And so the scorecard for the state of Mississippi in the two arrests was one trial with one acquittal and one set of charges dismissed. And so the case is now 50 years old. There is almost no likelihood of its being reopened. It's not, strictly speaking, a cold case, but as far, I think, as the state of Mississippi is concerned, it's a done case. And my interest in the book is partly personal. If you look into the book, you'll see that I was born in McComb. I was only 4 when Tina Andrews was killed. If anyone ever mentioned the case in my hearing, I don't recall it. And so one of the questions driving me through the story, or through the research for the story, is how could the murder of a girl, a 12-year-old girl, in a small town like this be unpunished and in many ways forgotten? And so that was what I was after in the book. Many Mississippi stories. Let me add this. As I wrote the book, as I was telling people about the book, people almost always would say, well, she was black, wasn't she? It's like, no, she was white. The police officers were white. Practically everyone involved in the case was white. But people are used to deep Southern stories, Mississippi stories, that deal with race, especially stories from the 1960s. One of my interests here was in seeing the ways in which social class interacted with questions of race. How two girls, the murdered child and the witness, how two girls from undistinguished working class backgrounds could have found themselves greatly disadvantaged by a system that had been set up and maintained very much for the subjugation of African Americans, but it also worked to check the interests of working class whites. So I've tried to make it a story that shows something a bit unfamiliar in a familiar place. Let me look down and see if anybody has questions or comments. I would be glad to try to field them. Again, I apologize for the late start of this discussion today. If you're watching this now, or if you watch it later and have questions or comments for me, I would be delighted to answer them in any. Yes, Craig, thank you for joining us. Let's see. Let me read my friend Craig's question. How rare was the random death? Craig asks, how rare was random death and murder like this in small town Mississippi? There were when the remains were discovered in the oil field in August of 1969, there were 4 women or girls missing or unaccounted for in the area. Not all of them were murder victims. Some of them were quickly accounted for, others not so quickly. McComb and southwestern Mississippi were violent places, but America was a more violent place in the era. If you look at crime statistics from the period, beginning in the 1960s and moving into the 1970s, if you're measuring the murder rate, this was a more violent period than the one that followed it. So people were not making things up when they believed that there were law and order issues that should be addressed at the period. One of the things, the other comment, Craig, or the other question, element of Craig's question here is a question about attitudes toward women, attitudes toward children in the period. I mean, one of the striking things in researching this case, let me throw out a couple. Women did not serve on juries in Mississippi until 1968. There were women on both the juries that heard this case. African Americans did not serve on juries in Mississippi until years just before this case. So that was one of the elements that had changed, but what was common in Mississippi and in America at the period was that people like Billy Joe Lambert, who testified at the trial, didn't have the same kinds of protections against their reputation being made part of essentially what was being tried. The questions about, say, the reputation, the sexual reputation of female victims of violence. It was a different world in that sense. Attorneys these days simply wouldn't allow the kinds of questions that Lambert as a witness was forced to answer. I mean, I know that's not a full answer to your question, Craig. Let me try to answer one or two more as I'm finishing up here. A question from Jenny at LSU Press asks, what was the most surprising thing I found out about my hometown while doing research for this book? One of the most surprising things that I found out in doing research for the book was that a great uncle of mine was the foreman of the jury in the second trial. He's been dead for years. He spoke to other members of the family about his work on that jury, but not to me. I also found out that relatives of mine attended the trial. And so, I had a sense as I was writing the book that I wish I had gotten interested in the topic 10 years earlier, when some of these people might have talked with me. One of the other things that surprised me very much about my hometown was. This sounds like a small matter, but it's a question of for a historian, I'm trying to build the case not from rumor. not from what somebody knows to be the case, but from what I can document. And one of the sources that I wanted to draw on was court records. And I was surprised at how unsystematic the saving of court records from the period has been. I had a sense that I would walk into courthouses and find that things would be neatly at hand. It's not the case. I wanted a trial transcript. I presumed when I began writing this that a trial transcript would naturally be generated and naturally be on file in the courthouse. It wasn't. I write in the book a little bit about my adventures in searching for a copy of a trial transcript, which I finally found not in the courthouse, but in private hands. And so, I guess one of the surprising things to me in trying to build the story was just an access to records. What kinds of things could exist? Another surprise was that people that I had presumed would talk to me about the story would not. People that I presumed would not talk to me about the story would. So some of my expectations were turned upside down. Let me make this the last question, maybe from James at LSU Press. It says, how is the experience of writing this book different than writing other books? This book, frankly, became an obsession. My family will tell you that. I made multiple trips to McComb over a period of a couple of years. I walked the same downtown streets that these girls did in 1969. I timed myself walking from one corner to another corner. I tried to imagine the directions in which cars could have come to pull up at the curb to pick up the girls that evening. I called people, I knocked on doors, I drove deep out into the county and surrounding counties trying to find people who would be willing to talk with me. So I had a kind of investment in the book, in the topic, that I did not have in some of the other books that I've written. I mean, I've cared about the other things that I've written very much, but this was a topic that ate at me. Tina Andrews is buried in the main cemetery in it's sort of at the center of the town of McComb. And whenever I went to that cemetery, I visited graves of 4 of my grandparents, of my father, but I also would always walk over to see Tina Andrews' grave. And as I stood there more than one occasion, I looked at the grave and I said, I'm going to do my best to try to explain how a 12-year-old girl could be murdered. There could be a witness who came forward to say, I can tell you what happened that night, and nevertheless, the state of Mississippi has not, and I believe probably will never, convict anyone for the killing of Tina Andrews. It seemed to me a terribly sad story, and that's one of the things that drove me to try to tell it. Right. Thank you guys for listening this afternoon. If you have other questions or comments, I will be glad to try to field them in any forum. Again, thanks to LSU Press for publishing the book. Thanks to LB Kovac for setting up the this event this afternoon. I apologize again for the technical difficulties at the beginning of it. And thank you all, and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.